Is photography art? Well, that was a question that arose immediately. Photography was invented in the 19th century. It was fiercely debated in the Victorian period. So I'll start with the development of photography and show how this question was tackled in many different ways. But first, before photography, the only way to capture an image of the world was for an artist to draw it or paint it, and then it was very difficult to reproduce that in quantity. So what I'm going to do is to start with a few points, a few techniques that were available for the mass production of images before photography. We take image production for granted now, but before photography, the earliest way of recording an image was the woodcut. A wooden block was carved, ink rolled onto the block, and then a piece of paper pressed onto the block. The ink would only be on the raised original surfaces, not in the areas that were cut away. So the areas that were cut away would be the colour of the paper, typically white, and the original ink surface, typically black, would leave a residue on the paper. So if you look at this image, which is of a wood block cutter at work carving a block of wood, the white, as I said, would be where the wood had been cut away, and the black is where the wood had been left, and then when the ink was rolled onto the surface, it was the raised original wood that took the ink and transferred it to the paper. The other method was engraving, and this produced a finer image, and it was first used in Europe in the early 15th century. It's the opposite of woodcut, in that the incised lines, the lines cut into typically a metal plate, produce the black, and the uncut areas you see remain white. So what the artist would do, and this is by Albrecht Dürer, is to take a metal plate, originally copper, gouge lines into the metal plate using something called a burin, which is basically a sharp point that you use to scratch the metal plate or actually cut lines out of it. The ink is then squeezed onto the plate and wiped away from the surface, so that the only ink that remains is in the gouged grooves. And this technique is called intaglio. And then when the paper is put onto, in fact pressed onto the paper, and you need a high pressure press for this, the paper is sort of forced into the grooves and picks up the ink in the grooves, and the original metal plate is left white. If you look at a close-up, you can see more clearly where the artist has gouged the lines. That's the black areas that pick up the ink from the grooves that were cut. First used in 1516 was a technique called etching, where, similar in a way, but the lines are produced by acid. So what you do is you get a metal plate, cover it with varnish or wax, and then the artist will scratch through the varnish or wax. When finished, they then put the whole plate in an acid bath, and where you've scratched away the wax, the acid eats into the metal plate. You then wash away all the wax with a solvent, and then it's similar to engraving. You cover it with ink, making sure it goes into the grooves, wipe the ink off the surface, press on the piece of paper, and that transfers the ink in the tracks that have been etched away by the acid. Moving on a bit, this is Paul Sandby. This is a watercolour of Roslin Castle, but the interesting thing is that it shows a woman here, bottom right, using a camera obscura to sketch. Now, these devices go way back. The Chinese described them in the 4th century BCE. It was revived by Leonardo da Vinci, became popular in the 18th century, and it made sketching easier for amateurs. This scene here, or this part of the scene, shows Lady Frances Scott, and she was an amateur artist, but of some repute. She's sketching onto the glass plate on top of a camera obscura. It has a lens at the front which transfers the image via a mirror onto a ground glass plate at the top, and she's laid a piece of paper onto the ground glass and is copying what she can see underneath onto the paper. This particular viewpoint is of Roslin Castle, which is about 8 miles from Edinburgh. In fact, it wasn't, this technique using a camera obscura wasn't just used by amateurs, it had been used by artists, and in fact Paul Sandby, who painted this, used the camera obscura to keep a quick visual image of his journeys. The woman alongside her to the right is Lady Elliot, who's adding a picturesque element to the scene and looking at Paul Sandby as he paints this image in watercolours. It was the camera obscura. Imagine if you're using a camera obscura and you're laboriously copying what you see. It must have crossed many people's minds that if only we could put something onto the plate of the camera obscura that is sensitive to light, it would record the image. And it inspired a number of well-known names: Thomas Wedgwood, Joseph Nicephore-Niepce, Henry Fox Talbot, to find ways to do precisely that, to automatically record the image using, obviously, some light-sensitive material. Before I move on to some of the first photographic images, I thought I'd just end with what became the modern method of reproduction and started as lithography, invented in 1796 by a German actor and playwright, Alois Senefelder. You'd get a limestone slab, draw on it with wax or oil or fat in some form. Then you etch the stone with acid and gum arabic, and that makes the bare stone that you haven't drawn on more water attracting. You clean the stone and the wax areas will repel water, and the bare stone attracts the water. So you then apply an oil-based ink, and it's attracted towards or repelled away from the water areas and attracted to the areas you drew on. And you then put a blank sheet of paper and press it onto the stone with a printing press, and it transfers the image onto the paper. It took a few years, I think it was about 40 years later, multicolour printing. So you can see this early, and I've chosen an artist that was drawn towards using lithography, the well-known artist Theodore Géricault, and he quickly mastered the technique. But you can see here early lithographs were black and white. Colour printing, which used a stone, a limestone slab for each colour, was invented, as I said, about 40 years later. And within a few years, within about 15 years, it was lithography that replaced all the other techniques for mass market reproduction of images. It was cheap and easy to use. And today we still use it. It's called offset lithography. The word offset is because the image is first transferred from a metal, or today plastic, plate onto a rubber blanket before being transferred to the paper. It was discovered, in fact, by accident, that doing this, transferring it to rubber first and then the paper, causes the image to become clearer and sharper. So we've now reached the period when many inventors were trying to record that image from the camera obscura and experimenting with ways to capture the image permanently. One early image, now lost, was made by Thomas Wedgwood, the potter, in 1800 on bitumen, which was light sensitive in the sense that sunlight softened it, and so the soft bitumen could be washed away. But the image was very faint at the time and no longer exists. So this is the first surviving permanent image taken by Joseph Nicephore Niepce in 1826 or 27. It took several days to record and can only be seen by holding up the metal plate on which it was recorded at an angle. What you're looking at here is a large house, and Niepce did come from a wealthy family, and because of that they had to flee the French Revolution, but later he worked as a staff officer under Napoleon, and in 1801 he returned to his family estate and continued his scientific research. Now he knew, in fact everybody knew, that silver chloride, in fact all the silver halides, silver iodide, silver chloride, darken when exposed to light, so could capture the image. But no one knew how to fix it. Fixing the image was the tricky bit. In 1816, Niepce captured a small negative image using silver chloride and tried many different chemicals to try and fix it, but without success. So, in fact, he then used Wedgwood's technique. He used bitumen painted onto a plate. The sunlight hardened the bitumen and it would resist being eaten away by an acid and acted as a acid resist. So it was a sort of a form of automatic engraving. And it was used to create the world's first photographic image in 1822, but unfortunately it was later accidentally destroyed. So as I said, this is the earliest surviving image. Now, a couple of years later, in 1829, he went into partnership with, perhaps you'll know this name as much more familiar, Louise Daguerre. Now, Niepce died about 4 years later, and Daguerre concentrated on the use of silver salts, trying to find a way of fixing the image. And he, in due course, invented a process that he called the daguerreotype. So it's Daguerre who became known as the father of photography, although the process was actually discovered by Niepce and refined by Daguerre. Daguerre said, on first seeing an image that he produced, "I have seized the light, I have arrested its flight." And the French government in 1839, which was the date by which he'd got the whole process working consistently, the French government agreed to pay him a pension for life of 6,000 francs and incidentally 4,000 francs to the family of Niepce, who, as I said, had died by then. And in exchange for the invention, they offered it free to the world. In fact, that's a bit misleading because it sounds as though anybody in the world could use it. The world meant France and its territories. So they offered it free to anyone living in France or its territories. The technique he used, the technique he discovered, was a copper sheet plated with silver iodide and fixed using salt water. Later, a substance that will be familiar to the photographers amongst you called hypo, originally called hyposulfite of soda, now called sodium thiosulfate. And that chemical hypo dissolves silver halides. So when exposed to light, it turns dark because the iodine and the silver are separated. So when you dissolve away the silver halides, you leave just the silver black image. In fact, hypo and the fact that it dissolves silver halides was discovered by another scientist, John Herschel, who freely informed Daguerre and Fox Talbot in 1839 because he knew they were working on photography. Which brings me to William Henry Fox Talbot. He'd been working in parallel in the UK. And I mentioned Wedgwood as the earliest, but he couldn't find a way of fixing the image easily. That was Fox Talbot. And this is one of the earliest photographs he took. It's a leaded light window of his home, Laycock Abbey, which can be visited now. It's about 10 miles from Bath. And there's a museum there of his discovery and his equipment. He won a prize in classics at Trinity College, Cambridge, and went on to study mathematics and optics. And he began to experiment with what became photography. And his first photograph he took in 1834. And this first successful photograph he took the following year. Now, when Louis Daguerre exhibited his pictures in 1839, Talbot realised he was about to be eclipsed, and so he showed his by then 3.5-year-old pictures at the Royal Institution the same year, and he submitted his process to the Royal Society in February, 6 months before Daguerre, but both Fox Talbot and Daguerre obtained patents in the UK for their process. Fox Talbot announced the discovery, or made it available, in 1841 and called it the calotype, later Talbot type, and it used paper coated with silver iodide. And unlike Daguerre, his technique produced a negative, and from the negative you could produce many positives, which wasn't possible with the Daguerre technique. It was just a single image that was produced. And using the Fox Talbot method, and by then Daguerre had refined his method, the exposure times were reduced from hours to minutes. By the way, Fox Talbot's often been criticised for patenting his work and charging a licence fee of £300. And a lot of people who haven't looked into it think because Daguerre was made free to the world, you didn't have to pay for Daguerre, but the opposite was the case in the UK. It was Daguerre who had a patent, and in fact charged more than Fox Talbot, and was more restrictive in what you could do with his process. Fox Talbot was very helpful to people who wanted to use his process, and was happy for them to change the process if they wanted to. And it was in fact Talbot's process that eventually became the standard in the 19th and 20th century. And by 1860, the use of daguerreotypes was rare. The early daguerreotypes were much higher quality, sharper than the early calotypes, but in 1851, which happened to be the year Daguerre died, a process called the wet collodion process, which used glass instead of paper, produced the same level of detail as the daguerreotypes. So let's get on to a little bit of art. There'll be more later. From the beginning, everyone was asking the question, but is this art? And from the beginning, Fox Talbot was convinced that one of the purposes of photography would be to create works of art. In fact, he calls photography, and this book he produced, The Pencil of Nature. He produced the book between 1844 and 1846 in 6 instalments, and it was the first photographically illustrated book to be commercially published. He had 2 objectives. He wanted to explain the different practical uses for photography, and he wanted to present photographic images as an art form. But as I said, it had other uses as well. The practical uses that he mentions include recording large collections. Previously, a large collection, say china or glass, had to be recorded individually, but you now could just take a photograph in that it's all recorded in one go. To record ancient works for posterity, to record buildings and scenes and one-off events. The book contains photographs, calotypes, 24, each one pasted in by hand, if you're wondering. And it showed the application of the new technology, and it was, of course, still very much a novelty, and many people didn't quite know what was involved. And so in the book, Talbot explains things. I'll give you a quote from the book. "The plates of the present work are impressed by the agency of light alone, without any aid whatever from the artist's pencil. They are the sun pictures themselves, and not, as some persons have imagined, engravings in imitation." He had to stress this because a lot of people couldn't believe that you could capture the whole image in one go. Let me give you an example from the book. This is plate 6. And Fox Talbot wrote, "The chief object of the present work is to place on record some of the early beginnings of a new art, before the period, which we trust is approaching, of its being brought to maturity by the aid of British talent." So we see here a well-balanced still life. In terms of composition, you'll notice that the broom visually balances the lamp the other side of the door. The frame, the entrance is framed. The diagonal shadow across the door runs parallel to the broom handle. The dark interior contains some detail that draws our eye into the interior. It's not just all black, but with the bright sunshine outside and the dark interior, the dynamic range is enormous. And what Fox Talbot has done is expose the image for the exterior, and the interior is lifted out of complete darkness by choosing a doorway that has that window behind. And even the tackle hanging on the left of the door also balances up the lantern, and the 2 plants either side of the doorway frame the picture. The second picture, in fact it's the second picture in the book from the first volume, and it contains in the book one portrait, the one artistic image, and 10 of the images were specific places: Westminster Abbey, Queen's College, Laycock Abbey, his home, and so on. So he's presenting it as an art form from the beginning, but also pointing out its other uses. This is a boulevard in Paris, and the reason it shows no people and no traffic is because the exposure times were still so long that no one still stayed still long enough for their image to be recorded. I've got an exception, or I've got the first exception to that in a moment, but before I show you that, I must show you this. This is the first book of photographs published the year before by Anna Atkins, an English botanist and photographer, a pioneer in the use of the cyanotype. which was a photographic printing process that produces this cyan blue print. They later became known as blueprints. It was a photographic recording process invented by John Herschel, of which more later. In fact, I've already mentioned Herschel as the person that discovered that hypo would wash away silver halides. She used this process to create this book, which is a record. It's called Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. And it was her own collection. As I said, she was a botanist. She pressed them herself. And this book was groundbreaking and influential. I don't know why her name isn't better known. But returning to Daguerre. Well, many people thought that an important aspect of, and an essential aspect of photography for it to be an art form was to be able to record people. Unfortunately, at that time, it took 10 minutes exposure, even in the sunshine. So it was difficult to record anyone clearly. And this is the first ever person or people to be recorded on a daguerreotype in 1838. I'll let you see if you can spot them. Now, a daguerreotype is a copper sheet, silver plated, that's been exposed to the vapour of heated iodine crystals, which turns the silver plating into silver iodide, which is light sensitive. And Daguerre, discovered how to strengthen or develop the image using mercury vapour, extremely dangerous, and then fix it by washing it in heated salt water, later hypo. The image, by the way, was reversed, and it had to be examined at an angle. You held up the copper sheet and then you turned it at an angle to your eye until you could see the image. And it was also mounted under glass because it was very sensitive. If you touched it, it wiped it away. And as I said, it could only be copied by taking another photograph. It was just a single image. There was no negative. In fact, studios who wished to have multiple images used cameras with multiple lenses to produce multiple images simultaneously. As it's a mirror image, I've actually reversed it. So just to enlarge the person, it's this person having their shoes cleaned, and I don't know whether you can just about make out the person cleaning the shoes, but you can certainly make out the man having his boots polished. He must have stood there long enough to be visible, maybe 10 minutes. Things developed very quickly. This is surprising to me, the next image, because this is 1844. This is just a few years before these techniques, Fox Talbot, calotype and the daguerreotypes, had been made available to the public, and photography was moving very rapidly. It's a picture of a person, whereas a few years previously the exposure times were too long. By this stage, by 1844, exposure times have been reduced to seconds, maybe tens of seconds, sometimes, depending on the lighting, minutes. And this is David Octavius Hill and his friend, the engineer Robert Adamson, in their Scottish photographic studio, taking a picture of Willie Liston using the calotype process developed by Fox Talbot. And sadly, Robert Adamson died at the age of 27, and David Octavius Hill continued on his own. And they produced the first substantial body of self-consciously artistic work using this new medium of photography. In fact, one watercolourist and critic, said, and I quote, "The pictures produced are as Rembrandt's, but improved. So like his style and the oldest and finest masters, that doubtless a great progress in portrait painting and effect must be the consequence." Another consequence, I believe, is that it was just 4 years after this that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was formed, based on a new style of meticulously recording of nature. Another photograph by Hill and Adamson. This is Elizabeth Rigby, who was a British author, art critic and art historian, married to the keeper of the National Gallery, who became later the president of the Royal Academy, president of the Photographic Society, and then later the first director of the National Gallery. Now, Lady Eastlake, who she became, and was the first person to argue that photography is not a fine art. So this started off the debate, and the reason she said that is that she argued that the free will of the intelligent being, as she put it, is required to create a work of art, but the photographer, she said, merely obeys the machine. She seemed to be unaware of the many decisions a photographer must make to capture a scene. But the second reason she gave is that a photograph serves practical ends, but art ought to be pursued mainly for its own sake. Remember, though, that Fox Talbot had already identified many uses of photography, including the practical, which she criticised, as well as the artistic, separate uses for photography. In a way, it strikes me as her criticism is a bit like criticising painting because we paint our houses. So it's just a practical pursuit. Finally, she also said that the artist creates a single unique work, but the photographer makes multiple prints, showing that it's a commodity, not fine art, which again is a rather strange argument because it would rule out Rembrandt's etchings as works of art because multiple prints were made from them. Those who championed photography as an art produced prints of an unusual artistic quality for this period, like this one here. And later I'll talk about Julia Margaret Cameron as one of the best known of those that sought to ennoble art and used, well, let me talk more about her later. One final work by Hill that I thought I'd include. This is actually a painting, but it's the first work of art painted with the help of photographic images. Now, Hill was a Scottish painter as well as a photographer, and he formed this early collaboration between art and science with a business objective. He agreed to paint the 450 ministers who founded the Free Church of Scotland. And so he took, in 1843, he photographed the 450 ministers and produced a painting of them using the photographs. And the painting is 4 foot 8 inches high and 12 foot long, and took 23 years to complete in 1866. So photography was changing the way events were recorded and the way artists worked and the way even that we see the world. But there was another train of thought about how photography should be used to create art. And the person I've chosen, in fact one of the earliest persons and best known at the time, is Oscar Gustav Rylander. And his belief was that the photographer should create the sorts of classical scenes, history paintings of the type that a grand artist would produce. And what we see here is a moral painting. The young man, or the two young men in the centre, being advised by the older man between them, are having to choose between, on the left, their right, the serious religious moral life. Sorry, did I say, let me get that the right way. The serious moral life is obviously on the right, their left. Sorry about that. And on the left, we see the immoral life and the young man being enticed towards it. Now, Rylander was one of the pioneering art photographers of the Victorian period, and he's known best today, I think, because he was the photographer that Charles Darwin used to produce the photographs that were included in The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, his 1872 book. And it's Rylander who seems to have invented combination printing, and that enables two or more photographs to be combined. In other words, Rylander didn't set up a studio with all these people in it. It was too difficult to photograph and produce such a large photograph in one go. He used multiple photographs. This picture, which was exhibited in 1857 at the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, is 32 photographs and took 6 weeks to produce. Let me show you one of the series of photographs. This isn't exactly the one that's included in the large picture, but it's one of a series that he took of these two models adopting the poses, and he chose one of the series to include and then combine into the other pictures that he took. So all these individual pictures were taken in the studio and then combined together. Oh, by the way, you might be wondering, the nude was barely acceptable in Britain in the early part of Victoria's reign, and it started to become accepted in fine art painting during the 1860s. This was therefore a very early example of the public exhibition of the nude. Perhaps more surprisingly, a copy of this print was purchased by Queen Victoria for Prince Albert, and in fact it was Queen Victoria's purchase of a number of paintings that included nude, mostly female nude figures, that helped endorse that subject in Britain. So this image was the first publicly exhibited photograph of a nude in England, the first major art photograph, and the first photo montage. The Met wrote that this photograph, The Two Ways of Life, was one of the most ambitious and controversial photographs of the 19th century. Just before I move on, a little bit more about the nude. Oscar Rylander, made studies of nude models and sold them to artists because it was it was cheaper and reduced the time and the cost of using models. It raises the question, I think, which has been much discussed, of the distinction, and if there's a distinction, between the nude, which is sometimes defined as a classicized or idealized figure in a painting, and the naked, a photograph of a man or woman without clothes. The painting was seen at the time as a purely aesthetic experience, but the problem with the photograph is that it was unacceptable except in very particular circumstances, such as an aid to drawing the nude. It was unacceptable because it was seen to be just a naked person, a borderline erotic. And in fact, these images, which were produced originally for artists, started to circulate much more widely, and a large business developed rapidly in these erotic photographs. And from 1851, it became very cheap to produce photographs with the development of the wet collodion process. And so the availability of erotic images spread rapidly across Europe, to the extent that in 1857, 6 years later, the Obscene Publications Act was passed in England. I was going to talk more. Let me move on, though, to photographs being used by artists to assist. This painting by Rossetti, Reverie, was based, we now believe, on this photograph, which was discovered. And a lot of artists kept it secret or didn't talk about their use of photography because the general public regarded as one of the necessary skills of the artist was to be able to paint and sketch from life without the use of techniques like using the camera obscura or using photographs. Not true, because even John Ruskin, the Victorian art critic, recognised their usefulness and took a photographer with him on trips to Europe. He wrote to his father, in fact, in 1846, that daguerreotypes were glorious things with very nearly the same thing as carrying off the palace itself. Every chip of stone and stain is there. Although later this early enthusiasm waned because he started to feel later that photography threatened high art, because certain types of high art which depended upon the representation could now be produced mechanically, and he regarded it as soulless. And we're now moving on to the sort of arts and crafts movement and a rejection of industrial society and the reintroduction of artistic skill and artistic craftsmen into art. Nevertheless, many artists like Rossetti did use photography and to assist them with the process of producing the photograph. I mean, it helped enormously because it meant that the model didn't have to sit there in that pose for hours on end. Rossetti, by the way, rarely exhibited his work. He hated criticism, and he was afraid that if he exhibited his work, the critics would write something nasty about him. But photography enabled more people to see his work and establish his reputation without him actually having to exhibit it. Right, returning to the topic of the ways in which Victorian artists produced photographs that would be seen as art. I've talked about Rylander. This is Henry Peach Robinson, another pioneer. He used multiple images as well. It became, after Rylander, it became quite quickly a standard technique, and one that was associated and increasingly associated with producing photographs that were to be seen as fine art. And the photographer would set an artistic scene in the studio, or many photographs taken on different occasions in the studio, and then combine them to form a harmonious result that looked like a painting. And that's exactly what you see here. The difficulty, it wasn't as straightforward as it seems, because they were very restricted in the way that they could combine the images, and all the photographs had to be taken with the same lighting, with the shadows falling in the same direction and so on, for it to look natural. And the photographs of the people on the left, I think, have been combined with the photograph of the person on the right, and then combined with a separate image of the background. Well, Robinson became vice president of the Royal Photographic Society, and he was one of those that strongly argued for photography as an art form. He was a pioneer of these techniques. Another example by Robinson, this image, perhaps surprisingly, because it looks as though it's a photograph taken in the studio. It was created from 5 negatives, and what it shows is, which the Victorians would realise straight away, is the death of a young girl with her grieving family surrounding her. It creates the same sort of emotional scene that we've seen in genre paintings, but the use of photography is different. It creates an immediacy and a different sort of emotional impact. And for that reason, it caused controversy. Now, it wasn't because it was a deathbed scene, that was common. It was because it betrayed, or it was betraying the event by the accuracy of photography and by the manipulation of the image. So there's some conflicting things here. People felt photography had a responsibility to record accurately. But the fact that it was accurate meant that it wasn't idealized, and they felt that the death of a young girl should be idealized. One person wrote that the picture is just a young woman in the flesh, a travesty of the ideal rendering an artist should or must give to spiritual beings on the point of death. So photography was at the same time too accurate, and therefore a travesty of the spiritual event. But because it was created by Robinson using multiple photographs combined, it was betraying the accuracy that was expected and demanded of photography. Because, as I said, it was felt photographers had a responsibility to record accurately. So photographs were criticised for being untrue while at the same time being too true. But let's finish with a revolutionary, I think that's a fair word, photographer who took this in a different direction. Julia Margaret Cameron. She pushed the artistic boundaries of photography before they'd even been established. I mean, people weren't even clear whether she was pushing the boundaries because they didn't know what the boundaries of photography were. We can only, looking back on it today, see that her images are far-sighted, or what we might call modern. She left no mark on photography at the time. She wasn't rediscovered till 1948. The American photographer wrote, Imogen Cunningham wrote, "I'd like to see portrait photography go right back to Julia Margaret Cameron. I don't think there's anyone better." And Getty Images have commented recently, Cameron's photographic portraits are considered among the finest in the early history of photography. Surprisingly, in a way, she wasn't given a camera. She was given a camera as a birthday present by her daughter and son-in-law when she was 48. and she took to it immediately, but she had to experiment, and this is the first print she produced which she was satisfied with. It's Annie Philpott, who was a local daughter of a local resident, and Cameron wrote, "I was in transport of delight. I ran all over the house to search for gifts for the child. I felt as if she entirely had made the picture. I printed, toned, fixed and framed it and presented it to her father the same day." I think that's an interesting quote because it shows that she believed, when you see the whole list of things she had to do, she had to frame and compose and print and tone and fix and frame, and yet she sees that the picture was made entirely by the young child. And this picture, her first picture, exhibits some of her trademark artistic effects: strong side lighting, intentionally slightly out of focus face, something that she used a lot, but not always, a background that places the dark side of the face in contrast with a light background and the light side against a dark background, which is a technique that portrait artists had used for hundreds of years. She may in fact have learnt the basics of operating a camera and the chemistry of photography from Rylander, Oscar Gustav Rylander, because she knew him. They shared many friends, and she mixed in high society. She was from a very well-known family, and so she started to take pictures of the great and the good of Victorian society. This is one of those, the most famous stage actress of the period, Ellen Terry, later Dame Ellen Terry, Shakespearean actress, born into a family of actors. She started, I think, when she was 9, acting in Shakespeare's plays, and then continued as a teenager. Now, when she was 16, she married the 46-year-old artist George Frederick Watts. And although they separated within a year, I think she ran off with another man, and she was soon acting again. On their honeymoon, they visited the Isle of Wight, which is where Julia Margaret Cameron lived, near Freshwater Bay, and she visited Cameron, which is where this picture was taken. And we don't know, but we could speculate that the sadness illustrated here, and that's actually the title, wasn't just posed but reflected the problems that were already evident in the marriage. What she said was very demanding, because he insisted she pose for him for hours at a time without speaking. Even when they had friends visiting, friends in the same room that he would speak to, he insisted that she didn't speak. Anyway, she went on later. There was a period when she didn't act, but she went back to acting and went on to become the leading Shakespearean and comic actress in Britain. This is George Frederick Watts. He's portrait by Julia Margaret Cameron. He the Cameron was actually, it's a complicated relationship here, but Julia Margaret Cameron was the sister of the person that lived in the house called Little Holland House, of which George Frederick Watts was a tenant and lived with them, Cameron's sister Sarah Prinsep and her husband Henry Toby Prinsep, for 24 years after assisting them take on buy the property. And it was Cameron who considered Watts her chief artistic advisor, and she wrote, "Mr. Watts gave me such encouragement that I felt as if I had wings to fly with. And so they knew each other well, and he was a well-known artist at this stage, and she was just, remember, starting out with photography, and he encouraged her in what she was doing. Alfred Tennyson, as I said, she knew all the rich and famous of society. And in fact, she, like Watts, was one of the first artists who decided which people he wished to paint himself rather than wait for a commission. He became so famous, he would go and see the person and say, "I'd like to paint you now." And Cameron was the same. She used her contacts to say to people, "I want to take your photograph now." She was, and this is the poet laureate, Alfred Tennyson. Poet laureate for much of Queen Victoria's reign, and one of the most popular British poets at a time, incidentally, when poetry was much read and very popular. This is Julia Prinsep Jackson, who later Julia Stephen, Cameron's niece, and the mother of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. She was well known for her extraordinary beauty. People used to talk that when she walked into the room would go quiet as everybody turned to look at her. She's portrayed her here as herself. You see her, the title is her name, and usually for portraits of women, she would turn them into a literary character or an emotion like sadness or a religious icon. The men, she would typically, with their portraits, she would name them after the name of the person. But Julia Prinsep Jackson was different. She became Cameron's favourite model, and Cameron took photographs, some 50 different portraits of her. This is the last portrait I'm going to show you by Cameron of Sir John Herschel. I said I'd come back to Sir John Herschel because he had a critical role to play in the development of photography, but wasn't himself really acknowledged as a important discoverer of photography, maybe because he discovered so many things. In fact, it was Herschel who invented the word photography. He was the first. He produced wrote a paper called Note on the Art of Photography, or the Application of the Chemical Rays of Light to the Purpose of Pictorial Representation, which he presented to the Royal Society in 1839. And that was the first time anyone had used the word photography. He also coined the words negative and positive, and also in 1860 the word snapshot. And as I said, it was Herschel who discovered that sodium hyposulfite, could be used to dissolve silver salts and so fix photographic images, a critical step. And the Met writes of this image, "No commercial portrait photographer of the period would have portrayed Herschel as Cameron did here. Devoid of classical columns, weighty tomes, scientific attributes and academic poses, which were the standard vehicle at the time for conveying the high stature and classical learning of someone like Herschel, who's extremely well-known and renowned scientist. He would normally have been presented as some sort of high priest of science, as he was revered and well-loved person and a friend of Cameron. She'd in fact known him for 30 years. So perhaps that explains why she's taken this picture of him. We know that she insisted that he wash his hair and tousle his hair, as she wanted it to be a mop of hair that caught the light, and she draped behind in black to bring this high lit hair out, jump out in the foreground and frame the face. She brought the camera close to the face to capture him, and he's sort of emerging from darkness like a vision of an Old Testament prophet. He was also an astronomer and son of the distinguished astronomer William Herschel. You might have heard of William Herschel, is the person who discovered Uranus. And that brings me to the end of the talk today. I raised the question about whether photography was an art form, and as you can see, the Victorians struggled with the question and tackled it in many ways. And what came out of the trials and tribulations and many experiments was that there are many different uses for photography. Some of those uses create something that was some people then and we now classify as art. But in fact, we're still experimenting with the various ways in which photography can be used as an art form. In this talk, I've reached the 1870s, and I'd like to go to the end of the century. Photography by this stage was becoming much more practical because Talbot's original process, which had become the standard, had become much easier to use with the wet collodion process of 1851 that I mentioned, but it became even more convenient to use in the 1880s because it was a dry gelatine plate was invented that didn't require the plate to be wet and for there to be a dark tint. And it was 4 years later, in 1884, that George Eastman in the States invented this dry gelatine film on that he put on film stock. And 4 years later, in 1888, he announced the Kodak camera. And as he said, you press the button, we do the rest. And at that point, the camera started rapidly to be used by millions of people. And so photography entered yet another phase. And that's what I'd like to talk in my next talk about, the development from the 1870s onwards to the end of the century, the sudden craze for the carte de visite, the armchair tourism, and things like war photography and the recording of events and so on. And then moving on towards the end of the century, the use of photography as an art form that for the late 19th and into the 20th century, known as Pictorialism. But that's all for now. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.